Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria, and this is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, India. It is one of the biggest defence spenders in the world, but it does it through imports. We're asking if that's really the way for an emerging superpower to ramp up its security, especially as tension over Kashmir continues to rise. Also, televised sport, but on which screen? Younger people are increasingly tapping into the world of streaming services, not to mention eSports. So where does pay TV fit in? Is it still the saviour of cash-strapped sports, or is it killing off the niche ones? And we'll take you to Bangladesh to see how traditional farming practices are offering solutions to the modern problem of climate change. You'll have seen in the past few weeks the increasing tension between India and Pakistan, two nuclear-powered neighbours. This was, of course, after India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi ended 7 decades of autonomy in Kashmir. We're actually not looking at that this week, but rather India's defence spending, because any unrest over Kashmir does give us pause. Let's go through this bit by bit. The last time the two nations clashed, a Pakistani warplane blew up an ageing Indian MiG-21 out of the sky, one which had been updated with Western technology. Modi's been criticised for delaying the delivery of new planes. A deal to acquire 126 Rafale jets was about to be signed off back in 2015, but he cancelled the order. Instead, he struck his own deal for 36 Rafales worth $8.7 billion, a deal which led to allegations of corruption. The shooting down of the MiG, though, raised other questions about India's ageing arsenal, most notably because of the way India is seen, particularly by the US, as a bulwark to rising China. But the problem is India isn't spending as much as China on defence, and probably with good reason. It's got other priorities, things like poverty reduction, education and healthcare. So let's pause there and think about India and China side by side on this defence spend. Now, Beijing's defence budget is huge, $175.4 billion in 2019, and some analysts actually reckon it could be higher if you take into account the acquisition of new equipment. In contrast, India's defence budget, just a third of Beijing's, coming in at $62 billion. However, India has been rapidly spending money in the past few years to update its war gear, at least. In 2018, it was the world's 4th biggest spender. Exactly what is India spending on? Well, here are some of the big-ticket upgrades currently underway. India wants to order 140 new aircraft worth $15 billion, and it's asked the likes of Boeing and Lockheed and Saab to make a pitch. 85% of the aircraft are to be made in India. As it steps up security in the Indian Ocean, the government's in the market for 6 missile warships and other vessels worth $2.2 billion. And Washington won't like this one, but India's spending $5 billion on buying Russia's S-400 missile defence system, plus another $5 billion on helicopters, warships and other gear. But here are the thoughts of some defence analysts. Is it really in India's interest to buy equipment from the likes of the United States and Russia? To maintain an independent military stance, should it not ramp up its own industry as part of Narendra Modi's Make in India campaign, which really has pretty much been a failure so far? Remember, India does have an independent space program, for example, and it's a successful one. It's about to make a controlled landing on the moon, so the money and the will to spend are both there. So let's get some answers to some of these questions we've raised. Joining us on Skype from Chennai is Arjun Srikumar. He is a senior aerospace and defence consultant at Frost & Sullivan, and it's nice to have you with us, Arjun. You know, I think about, say, India's space program, which has been massively successful, and they've put a lot of money into it for it to be successful. I wonder if defence needs to be thought of in the same way. Got to throw some more money into it.
Kamal, throwing a lot of money into it is absolutely necessary, but budget top lines are not always indicative of spending effectiveness. So you need to go beyond the quantum of money that's being thrown into defense and look at how much of that money is being diverted towards capital acquisition, and also look at the amount of underspend that's there in India's budgets. So if you look at the capital expenditure component of Indian defense budget, it usually hovers at around 34 to 36%. And if you look at the underspend, it has been steadily increasing over the years. So this sort of points to the fact that there are deeper problems, especially with respect to procurement processes, that needs to be corrected for higher budgets to become more effective. Uh, Also, if you look at Indian defense budgets and factor out the revenue expenditure component, the pensions, and account for inflation, you'll find that the growth over the past few years has not been all that much, to be honest.
I just want to look at some specifics with you briefly, Arjun. You know, the deal for or the original deal for the Rafale jets, I think it was 126 of them, and the majority of them would actually be built in India. That's not happening. And you think about Narendra Modi's famous Made in India pledge, which he wants. The two things don't go together.
That's true to an extent, but you need to look at this in a couple of perspectives. The first question here is that just reducing the procurement numbers to 36 from 126, is it going to affect the operational effectiveness of the Indian Air Force? Well, yes, but I think that's just one part of the story here. There's a lot of procurement that's going to be lined up, especially for air platforms in the future, to cater to all these deficiencies in terms of number of platforms. Addressing the second part of your question here, Kamal, on whether it's in line with Make in India, if you analyze the deal, there is a clause which says that there's an offset clause which says that 50% of the contract value has to be invested in procuring defense items as well as services from the Indian company.
Arjun, I want to bring a bit of geopolitics into this now, and I'm going to leave Kashmir out of it for now because I think that's a whole huge issue on its own. But just more widely, you know, I think the United States, for example, would like to see India as some sort of counterweight in the region to the likes of China. That would involve, again, a lot of spending from India, wouldn't it?
Well, exactly. You're spot on, Kamal. If you look at Chinese spending in its military, it's more than 3 times of what India spends. And the US is planning to use India as a counterweight in its Asia-Pacific strategy. But for it to be a capable counterweight, India has to fast-track its procurements and reduce current obsolescence levels within its forces. India cannot counter China by numbers, but what it can do is it can modernize its forces with technology, advanced technology that can act as force multipliers. A trend that we see in global defense today is that there's a lot of commercial off-the-shelf technology that's being migrated from commercial to defense to improve operational efficiencies, to improve intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, improve tactical networks, etc. And India has a very proficient IT industry and a large number of technology-driven small and medium enterprises that can be leveraged to develop bespoke, digitized defense systems that can multiply operational capabilities and at the same time keep costs and offshore dependencies low.
And just pushing things out a little further, India has this long-held relationship with Russia going back to Cold War times. And now you have the purchase of the famous S-400 defense systems. How does that sort of play into things further? Again, I have to bring the United States back into it because of all the geopolitical tensions between all these players.
It doesn't bode well for any nation, and especially India, to create a dependency trap when it comes to defense procurements. So it's a wise move on India's part to keep its supply lines open, and also in terms of maximizing what it can get out of deals. So India is going to be a huge defense market over the next 5 to 6 years. It already is, but a lot more defense programs will be signed in the future. And there's going to be a lot of competition between US and Russia within the market. And I think what the Indian forces want is to get the best of both worlds whilst not being locked into dependency traps.
Arjun, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your time. Moving on now, and the Trump administration unusually has taken a step back from imposing more tariffs on China. They were due on September 1st, but Washington doesn't want to see price increases in the run-up to Christmas. An acknowledgement, finally, that US consumers are bearing the brunt of the trade war. But the collateral damage from the trade war is also being felt globally. Chile, for example, regarded as Latin America's most stable economy, has actually seen a sharp rise in unemployment. And our Latin America editor, Lucia Newman, has been looking at the impact from Santiago.
For nearly 3 months, 55-year-old Rosario Araneda has been going out every day looking for a job. She joins the queue at this employment agency, hoping, like the rest, to secure work as a housemaid, a job that used to be easy to find, but no longer.
If I don't work, I can't pay for my rent, my bills, my food. Without a salary, how can I survive? For me, it's essential.
The director of the agency says the number of Chileans looking for work is skyrocketing.
Last week, I was at an employment fair. Before, 85% of candidates were immigrants. Now it's 50-50. That means that a lot more people are looking for this kind of work for the first time. So we are trying to train and place them.
The sharp rise in unemployment is just one of the direct consequences of the escalating trade dispute between the US and China. The price of copper, Chile's main export, has fallen 17% this year. The value of the Chilean peso, regarded as one of the most stable in Latin America, has dropped to its lowest level in more than 3 years, making imports more expensive. Chile's export-based economy is particularly vulnerable to what economists call external shock. So what affects its main trading partner, China, has a direct impact.
Our export has been going down this year beyond the effect of copper price at a very worrying pace. So clearly the impact of what has been going on abroad is hurting us.
But perhaps no one has been more impacted by this crisis than the people that you see here. Tens of thousands of migrants have come here to Chile just this year alone, the majority of them from Venezuela. And they're here at the immigration department hoping to get their papers in order so that they can get jobs that are becoming harder and harder to come by. The economy minister tells Al Jazeera that he remains cautiously optimistic.
The macroeconomic and financial fortitude of our economy will allow us to confront this adverse situation.
But for how long is the question, especially for people like Rosario Araneda, who cannot afford to wait for the trade war to end.
One for the sports fans now, and the English Premier League is kicked off for 2019. It's fair to say it is the richest football league in the world. It got there through multi-billion-dollar deals struck with pay TV channels globally, not just in the UK. And seeing the money roll in, many other sports have sought similar deals with the rich networks. But at what cost? Many are losing younger viewers to eSports. You might remember the $30 million three-day Fortnite World Cup Championship held in New York recently. The winner, 16-year-old Kyle Giersdorf, who beat 99 other players and walked off with $3 million. And every other player took home $50,000, which is on par with what some golfers pick up just for turning up to a tournament. And the average age of these players, 16. All this essentially for a video game competition which could be watched on YouTube. Contrast that with an established sport like cricket. Its showpiece tournament was held in England and Wales recently, the ICC World Cup. But the average viewership on Sky Sports, a pay channel, was only about 600,000 per game. Now, when England made the final and it was broadcast on free-to-air TV, 7.3 million people watched what was admittedly an incredible final match against New Zealand. And here's another example, the recent FIFA Women's World Cup, which saw record audiences in France and England because the matches were on free-to-air networks. It was seen as a huge success, with the women's game finally getting the recognition, if not the same level of pay, for its stars. But as competition hots up and the likes of Amazon and Facebook and Twitter sign more sports deals, the landscape is definitely changing. But are they able to keep hold of the younger viewers who are frankly the lifeblood of the sport? We're going to talk more with someone who's done some research on audience. Manal Modo's with us, consumer research lead at Ampere Analysis, joining us from London. Nice to have you with us. Look, we know viewing habits are changing. Streaming is where it's all at. But when it comes to sport, should these sorts of, big legacy sports, the cricket, the Formula One, should they now be worried that these viewing habits are really going to affect them?
I think, viewing habits are changing. We are seeing that there has been a decline in people watching regular TV channels across not only younger demographics, but older ones as well. And there has been an increase in people watching through smart TVs, through their tablets, through their mobiles. So I think these sports are going to have to be reactive to these changes. F1 is doing it with the likes of F1 TV Pro, and I'm sure cricket will probably be looking at doing it. But I think you've got to be really careful not to then undermine your current audiences as well. A lot of sport fans tend to be a bit older. So if you take everything off TV, you'll actually end up damaging your sport as well.
So is there a way to have the best of both worlds then? I mean, I know, for example, in the United States, some of the big sports, baseball and the like, they're streaming on Twitter and Facebook, which is great for the younger generation. Can you do that and be on television and still make it all a success and keep everyone happy?
Yeah, I think you can. I think there's a good mix of both. The American sports rights holders are a really good example. So the likes of the NFL, the likes of the NBA, what they do is they have these massive TV broadcast deals where they're earning a lot of money. But then they also have their own streaming platforms, which consumers can access at a much cheaper rate. But what they basically do is they make sure that games that are televised on TV are not shown on those platforms live. So they're also protecting the major money that they're making through these broadcast deals, but they're also ensuring that their content is still accessible to younger audiences who maybe can't pay $50, $60, $70 a month to access this through pay TV.
Well, OK, good. You've mentioned pay TV. Let's look at the pay versus free-to-air TV. Cricket World Cup was in England not long ago. It was all on pay TV, and there was a lot of criticism that, kids couldn't necessarily get to see the cricket. They didn't even necessarily know the Cricket World Cup was on. And then you got the final played on free-to-air television, but only because England made the final. Can free-to-air compete? Is it, can you strike deals with the pay groups?
I think if you're putting it at level playing field, they can't really compete. They just don't have the budgets to do so. But I think what's important there is for rights holders themselves to understand the power of free-to-air. The Women's World Cup was on free-to-air in a lot of markets, and they got record audiences in so many of them. And when you're trying to get new fans into sport, whether it's the younger audiences or whether you're a new sport in your own right, making sure that people can actually see your sport and are able to watch it is such a huge part of it. So putting it all behind pay TV and behind paywalls is not the best thing for the long-term safeguarding of the future of that sport.
Women's sport is really interesting. You mentioned the Football World Cup there. Do broadcasters maybe need to take a punt there and go, yes, we're going to actually go right in with women's sport and televise more and more of it and actually give... Because that Football World Cup proved people will watch it. If it's there, they're going to watch it.
Yeah, 100%. I am a massive women's sport fan and like women's football in general. So I really do think that broadcasters should take a punt with it. It's still quite new. It's still developing. In a lot of the countries, it's only become professional in the last few years. So it means that the quality of the football is getting better. There is a real opportunity to showcase this sport, which is not as tainted as men's sport is. There isn't those massive sponsorship deals. There isn't, all the issues that come with men's football, the fact that it isn't accessible, you have to pay so much to watch it. All of that isn't there with women's football. You can go to a match for relatively cheap, in the UK in particular, and you can go and inspire that next generation. The UK is a really good example because the government have actually put it on the crown jewels list, which means that it is going to have to be on free-to-air TV for the foreseeable future. And I wouldn't be surprised if FIFA tries, or even, UEFA with the Champions League or with the Euros, they try to make sure that it stays on free-to-air for as long as possible.
Manal, there is other competition in the form of eSports. Much was made recently of the and I don't know that much about it, but Fortnite, the game which all the kids are playing, and there was millions of dollars in prize money, and people were watching it, people were going to see it live, and it was huge. I mean, is that, again, another threat for the major sports?
I don't necessarily think it's a threat to legacy sports. I think, they can work in harmony with each other. I think more so it's about making sure that sports are engaging fans at a much younger age. There's a lot of research out there which shows that people become sports fans between the ages of 8 to 12, whereas what we're seeing at the moment is that age group is becoming fans of esports, and they're watching on free platforms like YouTube, Twitch, Microsoft's Mixer. So, sports rights holders like the Premier League, like the cricket's ICC, they have to make sure that they're making their content accessible enough that these young kids are able to go see football matches live, they're able to play football, or they're able to watch it on TV, because, esports is so accessible, people are able to watch it around the world for free, that what you might end up doing is you might end up with a generation of people who you lose because that's what they end up watching instead of getting into all these bigger sports.
Champions League, seeing as you mention it, and this takes me on to the issue of illegal streaming and piracy. 5 million people, apparently, estimates, were watching Champions League football on illegal streams. Is there anything that can be done about that, really?
I think you've got to look at it in context. An average Champions League final gets between 350 to 400 million viewers, according to UEFA. So that 5%, if you're spreading them out across the season, is actually representing like 1.4% of that entire universe. So whilst I'm not trying to say it isn't a big problem, it is. But the likes of UEFA have done so much in the last few years to try and combat it. And it does seem to be working. Our research is showing that in a lot of the markets that we survey, the number of people who are watching pirated content is reducing. So there does seem to be a bit of a shift away from people trying to access this pirated content.
Manal Moda, it's been great talking to you about this. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Finally this week, Bangladesh. With its low-lying terrain, its unpredictable weather, it is more vulnerable than most countries to the effects of climate change. But as ever, with crisis comes change, pushing some farmers to revive a century-old system for growing crops. Tanvir Chaudhry reports from Pirojpur on Bangladesh's floating farms.
Low-lying Bangladesh is on the front line of climate change. Its farmlands facing constant floods, erosion and salinity. To combat this, farmers are using rafts, which remains afloat for a period long enough to grow vegetables.
The problem is during high tide, this area gets flooded with little water remains during low tide. This is why we're using floating beds to grow vegetables.
Floating platforms offer up to an additional 40% of arable land, creating opportunities for poor landless farmers. Aquatic farming, a century-old practice in Bangladesh that almost disappeared, is making a comeback. With limited land, resources and threats of climate change, people here are now starting to appreciate the importance of environmentally friendly traditional cultivation systems. Musammat Nurjahan can earn around $2.50 for days' work.
We use organic fertilizers on these seeds, then keep them in a shaded area to mature. Later, we plant them in the floating beds with natural fertilizers and sell them when ready in the markets.
Farmers generally do not use chemical fertilizer or pesticides using this method, so there is a greater demand for them.
These plants and vegetables are from the floating beds. Farmers bring them to us by boats. We then carry them again in boats and sell them at various bazaars.
This year, floating seed beds have been used on 290 hectares of Pirojpur's marshland area. There are now around 50,000 people involved directly or indirectly in this type of farming in the district.
This method of farming is getting really popular and is now practiced in at least 15 to 20 other districts. Farmers are making a good profit.
Many poor Bangladeshi farmers have now been given a financial lifeline by turning back the clock and relying once again on a traditional farming technique to protect their livelihoods.
And that is our show for this week, but we'd love to hear from you. You can tweet or message me directly. I'm at KamalAJE. You can use the hashtag AJCTC as well, or the email address countingthecost@aljazeera.net. And you can visit us online as well, aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page with individual reports, links and entire episodes for you to catch up on. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.